So we're going to talk briefly about, I guess, the content of the Charlottetown Conference and sort of what's going on there. There's some really, really, really great stories out there about what's happening in terms of the narrative of the Charlottetown Conference, including things like, wait a minute, they spent how much on alcohol, which was sort of one of the pieces of information that I really love talking about because for each delegate at the Charlottetown Conference, I think the average I think we worked it out the last time, and when we account for inflation, it works out to be about $8,600 for in alcohol alone for every single delegate at that conference, and the conference only lasts 10 days. So there's a lot of sort of narrative history in there about like, wait a minute, who did what now? Which sort of leads into all kinds of other great stories if you want to go there about, John A. Macdonald being so drunk that he gets kicked out of Parliament often. All of that stuff is there. What we're going to talk about right now, though, is actually like the content of that conference and sort of what is happening there. So again, please remember that in at the Charlottetown Conference in 1864, and in the Confederation that sort of is created in 1867, we're not talking about all of Canada. So we're talking about the part of sort of southeastern Quebec, part of the southern sort of tip of Ontario around what is now Toronto and that sort of thing, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and that does not include Newfoundland. That does not include any number of sort of places. If that doesn't include anything sort of west of that. Rupert's Land is sort of that band, and you'll see this on the map in this unit's PowerPoint, but Rupert's Land is essentially that band around Quebec and the sort of like from the Northwest Territories to the coast of Manitoba through the northern coast of Ontario and then up through the coast of Quebec. And that's because, and it belongs to the Hudson's Bay Company because the British Crown granted the Hudson's Bay Company without accurate maps of North America, which is my favorite part of this whole story, without accurate maps of North America, control of all the land whose waters drain into the Hudson's Bay. Which means that they had no idea how much land they were giving up, and that's one of the reasons why the Hudson's Bay Company wound up controlling such like immense parcels of land in Canada, is because the allocation of that land was given without an accurate map of like, hey, how much land does have water that drains into the Hudson's Bay, sort of in that sort of space. So, and then the Northwest Territories cover all of what is now the Northwest Territories, all of what is now the Yukon, most of what, a good chunk of what is now Nunavut, northern Ontario, like northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan. British Columbia exists with its borders sort of largely intact, but that's a separate colony in 1867. You'll sort of see all of those pieces. So, when we talk about the actual sort of content of this, it's really important to understand, first of all, that this was supposed to be a conference for the maritime colonies, which is why it's in PEI. So it was supposed to be a place for the representatives of Newfoundland and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island to sort of get together and to talk about their problems. And it essentially gets crashed by representatives of Upper and Lower Canada. Like they just show up and crash the party with an actual literal boatload of champagne. So there's a lot of sort of great stories if you want to talk about history that way. But for right now, we're talking about some content stuff. So as far as it goes, the maritime colonies are having this conference because they're starting to worry about their economy and their economic future. And these colonies are really close together and have economies that work in relatively similar ways, right? You're all talking about fishing, some farming, and you're all talking about things like shipbuilding because just where these colonies are located geographically. Um, and they're not super interested in confederation such as it is sort of eventually becomes initially, because their economies are actually doing better. They're concerned about them, but they're actually doing better than the economies in Canada West and Canada East, because they have that shipbuilding capacity. They still have these fisheries. So we'll talk a little bit about essentially what the Canadian government promise maritime colonies in order to convince them to join and to sort of connect to this project. We'll sort of deal with that. As far as it goes, Canada West which is sort of what is now Ontario, and Canada East, which is sort of what is now Quebec, have different reasons for coming to this sort of arrangement. So Canada East, or what the Francophone sort of province of Canada, is unhappy with the status quo, but is convinced that the solution to this problem is less influence from Anglophone Canadians. So they're already in this sort of space about what we really need is a separate political entity. We'll get to what that looks like in a little bit, but we've got some more conversations about that coming in this unit and the ones that follow. But Canada West has a really different perspective on what the goal here is. They're the most dissatisfied with the status quo, partially because essentially to get anything done, because of the way that their legislative assemblies are set up and sort of the practice that suggested that if you were going to pass anything in Canada, in sort of the province of Canada, what you needed to do was pass it in both Canada East and Canada West, and that the majority of the people, that the majority in the House who would be most affected, that majority was more important, which meant to say that it's really hard to pass laws assimilating Francophones when you need to get the consent of the Francophone province in order to do that. And so they're really feeling hamstrung and they're really dissatisfied with the status quo. So one of the reasons that they're sort of interested in moving forward with Confederation is to create that peace, and is to sort of eliminate what they're perceiving as a deadlock, right? Where they want to do the Anglophone thing and the Francophone Legislative Assembly keeps blocking them at every turn and they hate it. So there's that kind of piece. When we start talking about convincing other colonies to join, a lot of this is also connected to things like the construction of the railroads. If you are interested in sort of digging into that for your new information post for this unit, you can definitely dig into, for example, John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister's connection with railroads and the people who constructed those railroads and the sort of financial arrangements around that. That's a possibility. You can sort of look at that. But those railroads are really intended to do two different things. First of all, they're intended to facilitate trade between provinces, right? And we sort of talked about that a little while ago in our last discussion of Confederation, that east-west trade in Canada isn't really facilitated by geography because the rivers tend to run north-south, where the large navigable ones tend to. And so trading between, for example, what is now Ontario and the West is actually really challenging without railroads as an infrastructure. So there's that kind of piece. And the other sort of challenge is that without a railroad, what you're essentially telling new immigrants is, so by the way, you're going to spend 3 months on a boat, and you're going to land in Montreal, and then you're going to spend 3 months also with a horse and cart, and you're going to land in the prairies. And by the time you get there, it's going to be pretty cold, but you're going to have to live through the winter to be able to build your house. That's not a particularly appealing proposition to most people, and there's an interest in terms of dealing with that American expansionism to sort of address that challenge in terms of making the West accessible for colonization. And part of the way that they do that is by building railroads, because if you're taking a train across the country, it takes 4 days, not 3 months, and that gives you enough time to, build a house to shelter yourself and your family for the winter. So there are a couple of promises that are made at the time of Confederation, essentially in order to convince people to join. We talked about some of these. So the East-West Railway is a really, really important aspect of that. It's connected to both convincing the maritime colonies to join up because their economies are are better developed because the colonies are older than the sort of settlements further west in what is now Manitoba, what is now Saskatchewan, what is now Alberta. And so they're seeking markets, right? Remember this kind of conversation about mercantilism and how developed economies tend to be seeking both markets for their manufactured goods and cheaper sources of raw materials, right? So for the maritime colonies, those railways are appealing because they mean that you're going to attract cheaper raw materials, cheaper grain, furs, wood from Canada's west, and allow the maritime colonies to sell their manufactured goods also in the west. So there's that kind of piece. But that kind of relationship is also instrumental in convincing British Columbia to join. to join up to Confederation. So there's that kind of piece that's really, really important as well. Um, there's also the famous bridge to PEI to sort of end their isolation, because without that bridge, there's the only way to get to Prince Edward Island is by boat, or by air, but in the 1860s by boat. And I will say that that promise is a really long time coming. The Confederation Bridge, which is the bridge that goes to Prince Edward Island, is a promise in Confederation in 1864, but it doesn't open until 1997 because it turns out that the people who promised to build a bridge to Prince Edward Island had no access. They're like, we don't even have the engineering technology to build a bridge across the ocean, but they did by 1997, so that's sort of built. And there's also some promises that are made specifically to maritime colonies around infrastructure development. So the construction of roads, the construction of railways, the construction of shipyards, all of those sort of pieces that help build an infrastructure that is like an economy that is really, really meaningful. Those are the explicit promises in the Confederation document, but we've got some implicit ones too. And these promises are made again primarily to maritime colonies, but there's a promise there of relatively stable influence for those maritime colonies. So by the time we're signing these documents in 1867, the maritime colonies have realized, just like everyone else has, that Canada is a really big place, and that proportionally the amount of land that they control is actually really, really small. And for that reason, that also means that like there's always going to be the potential for more population living in what is now Canada outside of the Maritimes than inside it, just because there's sort of all of Alberta, Saskatchewan, all of the prairies, all of British Columbia, the northern part of Ontario, the northern part of Quebec. There's a lot of space there. So you'll see these sort of implicit promises for a sustained influence for the maritime colonies in terms of Canada's political landscape when you look at things like the distribution of Senate seats. So you could run the numbers on population if you really wanted to, but Alberta has 6 senators. 6. Anyone want to guess how many senators there are for Prince Edward Island? Because the answer is 4. And there are less than 100,000 people living on Prince Edward Island. So there are fewer people living in the entire province of Prince Edward Island than are living in Edmonton. But they have 4 senators and we have 6. And so there's that kind of implicit documentation in that. Likewise, you can talk about Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which also have smaller populations than provinces like Alberta. And they have 12 senators because that's how the document was set up. So when we look at sort of Senate composition, you'll sort of see that implicit influence where the Confederation documents in a lot of ways are set up to ensure that maritime colonies are always going to have a say in what happens to the sort of Canadian project, such as it is. I will mention that there are some relatively quick changes to what the landscape of Canada, sort of as a colony, looks like after 1867. Right? It takes a really long time to get to 1867, but after that, things change pretty quickly, at least in terms of that, as far as it goes. So, for example, Prince Rupert's land gets sold to the Canadian government in 1870. So 3 years after Confederation, the Hudson's Bay Company sells all their land to the Canadian government. They maintain the right to trade and the ability to trade on that land, but they are no longer the ones who own it and have to control it and administer justice. So there's that kind of piece. Notably, they bought the entire province, essentially like all of what is now Manitoba, most of northern Ontario, most of northern Quebec, for like 1.5 million, so less than a house in Vancouver or Toronto these days, just for some context there. Also in 1870, the other sort of big change in that is the creation of the province of Manitoba. It does not look like the province of Manitoba in 1870, but that is the province of Manitoba is created in 1870, largely in response to sort of Métis concerns in the Red River Rebellion. The promise of a railway becomes really, really important in that it convinces BC to enter Confederation in 1871. So by 1873, you've essentially got a political entity that looks pretty much like Canada does today. even though the one we had in 1867 looks very little like what we sort of understand the boundaries of Canada today to be.